We started out to have the idea that what consumers meant by power was, we started to realize this, was not at all what the engineers understood by power. So they learned that you had to be able to see power, that you had to be able to hear it, that you had to be able to feel it. So they eventually redesigned the car and added some features that made the car look powerful, feel powerful, and mechanically these things make a difference. And so this was sort of an iconic sports car that they were creating, but it didn't sound powerful, it didn't look powerful, and that was important as the actual power, which is what the engineers thought of. I have a doctoral student who did her work with a number of big corporations looking at how clients, how managers get an idea of what their consumer is like, understand what the persona is in effect. And the engineers were designing a product that went into the car, child seat, and the customers were very frustrated with it. But the engineers said, well, those stupid consumers, they don't know how to operate this properly, until they did some role playing. And they actually did get together and try to do these things themselves and say, yeah, I guess I can see how the customers would have a difficult time. So once again, it's a question of getting managerial buy-in, in this case engineer buy-in, to try to make this actually happen. And so maybe I'll stop there, because I think Galiza is going to come back with some other material, and I'll come back maybe with some other thoughts later.
Okay. I'd like to add a couple things to the depth and the detail and the revelations of the subjective experience that Russ is talking about. That's definitely one very important thing ethnography aims and delivers, and that's what inspires and provokes and puzzles the managers, and that leads them to take a particular action, or that becomes the stimulus in the collaborative sense-making meetings. But the other is, ethnography delivers actually a lot more than empathy with the consumer and the subjective experience, getting close to the subjective experience of the consumer. That's the subjective learning, if you will, the empathy with the consumer, putting yourself in their shoes, whether it be with the video or whether it be the company person, engineer or designer or marketing manager going to the field with the ethnographer. The second is the cultural meaning of that subjective meaning. So caressing, I love my cell phone, but what's the cultural meaning of that? That's the context. So a second big aspect of ethnography is to contextualize the subjective experience in a particular sociocultural, political, historical, economic context. For example, this morning I was talking to one of you on neoliberalization and how neoliberalization changes subjective experiences of the consumers. So the ethnographer delivers the subjective experience, but over and above the subjective experience, and to make even more sense of the subjective experience, the ethnographer contextualizes that subjective experience. And that's also a very, very, very important part of an ethnography. One other thing I would like to add is the video is a great tool, but it's not the only tool. I mean, this is going to be sort of one of my closing comments. We should be open to various different alternative ways of doing things. Video is great in delivering that immediate, authentic sense of I was there kind of a sense, the subjective sense. However, there are other companies that do it differently. Adidas, for example, works with a Danish research agency who does a variety of different ethnographic. They employ different ethnographers with different approaches, and they do different kinds of studies simultaneously. For example, at the same time, one group of ethnographers decided that they'll send out cameras, disposable cameras, to people, and ask them to take a photograph of why they go to a workout. And lo and behold, these were the female consumers. The photograph returned back was a little black dress. So it had nothing to do with being healthy or doing this, whereas in another ethnographic study, you would get other aspects of this. But with this returning of the photo, they found that it was really about fitting into the little black dress and not about much anything else. At the same time, the same research company took about 30 of Adidas's employees research design people, research and development people, engineers, design people, and people who work in brand management. And they trained them in basic ethnographic methods, and they set them out to the streets to spend 24 hours, yes, 24 hours, with one consumer. And then they came back together and collaboratively talked about what that experience was. Yet another aspect of the study was, that was for the more professionals. Obviously, Adidas has shoes for less professionals and more professionals. They were studying Bayern Munich football club. And, typically you would think product attributes, so you ask about this attribute or that attribute of the product. No, instead what they inquired was, this is a top football club in Europe. What they asked was, what do you think determines the success of a football player 10 years from now? See, this is what I'm talking about, thinking about the important things in life and daily life and the role of the product in that versus, would you buy this? Do you want to buy this? Do you prefer this? Don't you prefer this? Do you intend to buy this? Etc. And the thing that came out number one was speed. And the company, Bayern Munich managers thought that top European clubs are now in a situation where they can train their football players in pretty much all technical aspects of success except speed. Speed was not that trainable. It was trainable to some extent, but not as trainable as other aspects of playing football. So Adidas developed an ultra light shoe that would give more speed possibilities to the players. So it's also possible for companies to do research jointly with the ethnographers. I took part in one of those 25 years ago. So ethnography is not that recent. Motorola, I don't think it's a problem to mention their name, the headquarters was entering the Asian market, Central Asian market, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, etc. And they already had an anthropologist on board. She was trained anthropologist, she had a master's degree, half of a PhD degree, ABD, in anthropology. They hired me and they saw me as a market anthropologist, and they hired a third anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist. And we spent a month in the field working together, but relatively independently. We were told that we were each this was the day before these kinds of technologies. But the key thing was work collaboratively, but independently. So we each had our cameras, and we each took the pictures that we wanted to take. We each took our notes separately. Every evening we got together and went over what happened during the day for about a month. Now, the company at the time, and because of their entry strategy and the newness of the telecommunications market, etc., did not go to the extent of collaborative sense-making. So they did not include me and the other anthropologists in the decision-making process, but they got our reports, which were written much like stories and the pictures, and at the end, unlike your examples, we don't know what they decided, but we got a letter from the CEO saying this was the most useful consultancy they had ever received in their lives, but I don't know what that was. Before the closing, do you want to say something?
Well, we should ask for some questions, maybe.
Okay, some questions before we close. Yeah?
When we do ethnography for product and service, is there any difference in approach, or is it the approach the same?
Services are delivered a little bit differently, and I think there's a different role for observation in the case of services, because you can't just put the service there for people to look at and talk about, but it's one where they interact with people. It's something that lends itself very well to participant observation, to shop-alongs, putting yourself together with the consumer and seeing how they do interact with the service. Now, I'm assuming by service we're thinking of a face-to-face service. It's a little bit different if we're talking about a service delivered by the internet, for example. And in that case, a whole different line of ethnographic research is called for. But even in that case, you usually want to try to take the consumer offline and wind up with some face-to-face discussion, as well as just observing what's happening within a discussion community online, for example. So yes, there are some different sorts of things that you can and should do with services, but basically in all these cases, you want to have a big toolkit full of methods. And so you can try some shop-alongs, you can try some projective methods, you can try some depth interviews, you can try some group interviews or focus groups, for example, and you can try some observations. When we use the word ethnography, it's not just depth interviews with consumers, and it's not just observation or participant observation. It's usually at least a combination of those two methods. Increasingly, for anything that we're going to be looking at today, we want to also look at the internet representation of this thing and what people have to say online. And so that's increasingly a part of most any study as well. So you have the same toolkit, whether we're talking about products or services, but what you pull out may differ to some degree between the two, but there's a lot of overlap as well. You're pulling out the most appropriate tool for the problem that you're facing.
So my basic query was, in sequence where we start and end, is there a difference between product and service, or is the sequence same, like exploratory and then moving more to the confirmative stage?
Well, you can't obviously start with the confirmatory stage before you know what it is that you would like to confirm. And so, yes, we all start out a little bit more in the dark, and we have some prior knowledge, but we have to be flexible and willing to shift along the way. So if I was going to use focus groups at all, I would use them early on to discuss the topic, for example. And then we can go in and do some participant observation, which is going to raise some additional questions, and then we can go in and do depth interviews, and this is probably true whether we're talking about products or services. And so there's a general flow, but you should be prepared to mix it up and to try different things. I think any time that we're doing an interview, if we can go beyond just question and answer and bring in some projectives, bring in some visual things, and get people to react to things. It's always, it breaks up the exercise. It's oftentimes more fun. It can involve you and the informant looking at something rather than looking each other in the eye. And so there are certain things, I guess we all have our research styles too. Different researchers have different sorts of favorite techniques that really work for them. Gulis and I, along with Søren Askegaard, a Danish guy, did a 4 or 5 year project on consumer desire. And we began it by looking at how desire is expressed in different languages, in Danish and Turkish and French and English and so forth. And that was sort of our initial exploratory way of getting into the topic. And then we began doing depth interviews. We began having a number of projective techniques with people doing collages and telling stories and drawing diagrams and so forth. But it was basically trying a bunch of things to see what was going to work best. And it was only after 4 or 5 years of doing this that we were able to put it all together into a paper. And again, it's a little bit different if you're aiming for an academic paper versus when you're trying for appropriate managerial implications. And once again, things like revelatory incidents are important. And so in the case of Bank America, one of the revelatory incidents was that there are some people that sleep with their mobile phones so that they'll always be very close to them. And when they wake up, the first thing they do is to check their Facebook page and check their news feeds, and in some cases check their bank balance as well. It's sort of like taking your temperature to see if you're well or not, but in this case you're looking online to see who you are and how you're doing. And so these are the sorts of things that may be important to academic research, but especially in corporate research are oftentimes very important turning points in how we think about something.
I would like to underscore one aspect that he mentioned. It's not just a matter of tangible products versus services. I would second everything he said in terms of the specificity of any object, any service. It really depends on how familiar you are with the particular service or the product or whatever it is, and not what you think you know and don't know, how new the market is, how new the product is or the service is, and then think about, okay, this is what I know, this is what I don't know. These are the questions. So which methods should be best to start with? And that's why there's no firm list as to you should do this first and then that first. I agree, sometimes you do a focus group. So in some of my studies, I've first done a sort of focus group, but in other studies, I first had to observe before I could do anything else. So then I started with an observation. So it really, really depends on the particular object of study.
And remember, along with what Guli said, depending upon your amount of a priori knowledge, that the purpose of ethnography is to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And so one of the things in getting people to do wild and crazy things that seem fun and interactive, pretend that you're a customer in a sales context in buying a car, and pretend that you're the salesperson and looking at the interaction, is that it frees people up from traditional scripts, and it allows them to get into a different way of thinking rather than just bargaining for price. Whatever may be entailed is a thing that sort of unfolds naturally. Or to have people do a projective task or take some photos and interpret them later for you. So it's partly defamiliarizing people with what they expect is going to be occurring and showing them different ways of thinking and discovering thereby some new ways of thinking rather than just doing the same old thing and getting the same old questions we might get in a survey about attributes and so forth. So, hi, Rajiv.
Russ, when you were talking, the focus of a lot of what you were saying was on the value of qualitative research in communicating insight, how powerful it can be to communicate that key insight. But when it comes to the generating insight side, the common criticism is the sample size problem. Is the sleeping with the cell phone or the black dress, is it unique to that particular customer and not really meaningful to any other customer? Would it be unfair to say that the value add of qualitative market research is more on the communication side than on the generating side, or would that?
No, that wouldn't be fair. Because what we're trying for, if we talk about the power of big numbers statistically, or we talk about big data and how it's able to tease out nuances and things that we hadn't expected, but there's a power to small numbers. If you're dealing with customers and really doing depth interviews, and you're talking to people for an hour, 2 hours, you're observing them for 3 hours and longer, and you are doing this for a half a dozen people or a dozen people, and you begin to not only have an aha experience, but have that same aha experience with other people, you're beginning to get some closure with a relatively small number of people so that you can that you can eventually anticipate what you're going to be hearing or what you're going to be seeing without going and seeing or hearing from one more person. And so this is deriving insights, especially at an abstract level, that really do have, and you can test it out further, but they really do have generalizability. It's not just that this is an exploratory technique. We oftentimes look at a survey or an experiment as being exploratory, and then we dig in and see what's really happening. And so in that sense, it's almost reversing the logic that you're talking about. There can be true explanations that come out of qualitative research with a relatively small number of people.
And I would like to add that in terms of sampling, actually for us it's not the number of people, it's the number of experiences. So you can get 5,000 experiences from 3 people. Depends on how long a time you spend with those 3 people. So it's unfair, it's a different unit of analysis. It's not at the level of individuals, it's the level of experiences, events, incidences.
It depends, too, on how diverse the population is that you're dealing with and whether you're dealing with different segments within it, because across segments and across very different contexts, you may get different results. Now, does that mean you need to do 17 studies in 17 different places in India? Probably not, but you may want to go across states, across language groups to some degree to see whether the patterns are the same, because there are multiple cultures within India rather than just India being a singular sort of culture. And so when we do research that's culturally specific, and we need to have that cultural lens to be able to interpret things. And so if we were talking to people about how their diet has changed, we might talk to them about how their food now as an adult differs from the foods when they were growing up living in their parents' households, or how does what their children want to eat differ from what they themselves would prefer to eat or prefer to have their children eat. And we know that the meal is an especially symbolic, important time, that especially in India, the family is together for breakfast, and so that's an important time for social reasons. But we might want to look at across Indian cultures, is that always true, or is that true more in some Indian cultures than others, for example?
So actually, in this fast-paced market, behavior change. So what are the challenges you see in qualitative analysis, and how do you solve those?
Well, qualitative analysis, ethnography, looks at a situation right now in its specificity at this point in time. So it does face the danger of, not being able to predict tomorrow, because tomorrow everything is going to be changing if you think in that sample size being the individual kind of mental set. But if you think about the depth of the material that you get today, right now, at the specific moment, if you're talking about what they lack in their lives, what they're missing in their lives, the specifics of their daily lives, the conflicts and the tensions they face in their daily lives, that's not going to change from today to tomorrow that quickly. The means of dealing with those will change, but the basic human and cultural issues are much, much more persistent. So actually, qualitative research gives you a great handle on dealing with the changes, because it shows you the bases of these changes, where the conflicts are that derive particular changes, would be my response.
Yeah, if you were dealing with something like preference for mobile phones, yes, there's going to be a new mobile phone tomorrow that's going to be attractive and supplant the other one, but the functions that mobile phone performs change more slowly. If you were looking at something like standing out versus fitting in Indian society, the extent to which you can be conspicuous in your consumption, that is going to change, but it's going to change a little bit more slowly. And so it's not like a month-to-month change. It's more like 5 years to 5 years change. And so these patterns are ones that you should be aware of, because not everything stays the same, but there's trivial sorts of change, the particular mobile phone and particular applications and so forth, and then there's more fundamental change, and the fundamental changes are slower to occur and are interesting because you can see the patterns of change.
Yeah, what I meant was like the social network coming in picture, like the telephone being replaced by mobile phones. They were drastic changes.
Sure, we represent ourselves differently on social media, and in fact, one thing that I find changes is that there's more co-construction of the self. Someone puts up a photo of us and tags us in it, has some comments back to us fairly instantaneously, and we used to get this on the street. You really look good in that shirt. You should get more of this check pattern. It really looks good. But that happens infrequently and seldom, whereas you put up the picture on Facebook and you're going to get 5 comments in 10 minutes, depending upon the activity of your social network. And so in that sense, the social media have changed things, and I think we need to be aware of those patterns. But once again, it's a change that's more fundamental to social media rather than to that particular comment or that particular instance. And so, yeah, we want to be aware of some fundamental changes that social media have brought about.
Ethnographic studies. And if it is not relevant, why?
No. A little while ago I said it depends on the service versus tangible product question. It depends on what you know. Well, how do you know what you know? How do you know they're not just assumptions? It takes reflection, critical reflexivity, to think about your personal biases, your biases because of your training and your background, your biases because of your discipline, your biases because of your political position, as well as general a prioris. We have so many a prioris we're not even aware of. So reflexivity is critical. You know, I typically started an ethnography with a critical introspection and discussion with some friends and some further critical notes before anything else. So extremely important. In the beginning, while designing the study, while analyzing the study, because in the analysis you have another danger. You have deep data, okay? So, 5,000, 50,000 experiences, occasions, events, practices. So the revelatory incidences are brilliant, very, very helpful, but what if we're sucked into the seductiveness and exoticness of those and sort of forget the other things that are equally important when you try to understand the whole picture, or particular changes or lack of changes. So that requires also a lot of reflexivity in the process of analysis.
Ma'am, in extension to the same question, I just want to ask that when we incorporate reflexivism in our interpretation of our findings, there's many times it's been said that we being very narcissism with our approach, that we have put our biasness into it. How to minimize that and how to make our reviewer convinced about that whatever we have interpreted, it's not our personal biasness, but it is more like how we have seen and observed the things. Thank you.
You need to be basically honest. It's in the integrity of the researcher and communicating that. You need to be honest in terms of where you started, what steps you took to deal with potential problems. And I know what you mean. There are different writing styles as well, and you choose your own writing style. So you can go on a narcissistic trend, and if the reviewers and the editor is okay with that, fine, or the journal. But generally, as a general comment, I would say be honest and try to prove that you dealt with potential threats.
I gave a presentation in the Netherlands once and asked for audience questions, and the first question was, do you believe in God? But I was giving a talk about Mormon pioneers, and it was relevant. They were asking for my personal equation, where I was coming to this study from, and so it was a perfectly legitimate question. We're running out of time. I wonder, maybe we could hear from Ms. Tandon and her experiences in an Indian research context.
Well, I think the question and answer and the wonderful discussion that you gave was very, very interesting. I don't know whether there were any more questions, because I just wanted to say a couple of things and maybe ask a couple of questions of yourselves. You said that it's important to put yourself in the other person's shoes. And I thought that was quite, defines what qualitative research is, to see things from another perspective, maybe leave your narcissism behind, as somebody was saying. Do you find that being from another culture helps in that process at all, or does it hinder? I mean, what are the pros and cons from both of you?
As somebody who has lived in different cultures, I lived in the US and in France extended periods of time. And anybody who has lived in different cultures will share this experience. When you go to another culture, you're not only learning about, say I was living in the US, I'm from Turkey, so I was learning about the American culture, but at the same time I was learning a lot about myself. And when I went back to Turkey, I was learning about the Turks as well as about the Americans. So it's a two-sided response that I'm going to give you. It helps and hinders, and that's why working with colleagues with different backgrounds is a very, very, very useful thing.
Right.
I would add to that. I lived a year in Zimbabwe and a year in Romania and a year in Hong Kong and some other places. But one of the things that is a disadvantage of being too similar to the people that you're talking to is they say, well, you know what I mean, and you both sort of shake your heads. You're a Hindu, you know what I mean by that. And so one of the things you can do as an outsider is be dumb and say, I don't understand, please explain this to me as if I was a child. There's even a sociologist, Howie Becker, who's a jazz musician, and he's quite good, but he's interviewed other jazz musicians, and he just plays a total music incompetent. I don't understand this. How do you jam together? What is that all about? And so it can be an advantage, but it can also be that you've got to make up for that lack of knowledge and have informants help you do that.
I think that was a great answer, and I just add one more point to that, that if you are an outsider, sometimes you notice things. Because they're all Hindus, they know all about it, but you see something that may be different and needs articulation. Like, for example, in Southeast Asia, where I was for some years, every time we did a branding study or where there was a question of identifying with the brand, and the brand being me, a lot of people, especially youngsters, would come up and say, I can be me, and they said it with a lot of emphasis and very interesting ideas underlay that. When we asked why, or we tried to do lived with them or watched them and observed them, it ended up being something to do with self-confidence. And some brands they were using as a crutch for that, and that suddenly opens up a whole lot of questions about the culture. And this was happening especially for young women, young adolescent and youthful women. And women have been role-bound there. And they were emerging because of this consumerism and material stuff all over the place. And many of them were working, first generations working, and had their own money to spend. And it was interesting how brands suddenly, they took them to heart. So when I came back to India, just like you were saying, you started looking for that, because that's exactly what we're going through now. The women are moving out of their role-bound bahus, the daughter-in-law, the mother-in-law, whatever it is, that we don't have any place to express ourselves as individuals. You'll hear a lot of it in journalese and in the media channels and so on. And the only reference I could find was in Jab We Met, which is one of the movies that Kareena Kapoor has done, starred in Bollywood again. She said, "Main apni favorite hoon." That means I am my own favorite. There was some kind of discussion with, I think it was Amir Khan, the star, and they were talking about favorites, and everyone had a favorite. And she said, "Look, I'm my favorite." So she had a right to be her own favorite, which was very interesting. But I haven't seen anything else of that kind. So it raises wonderful questions about, are we there yet? What's happening? Why hasn't it come into the marketplace? Or maybe it has, but people, like Guli said, these things are inarticulated, they're not articulated. And that's why it's so important to be there, to observe and to see for yourself, because we've done a lot of work for rural people, and I was going to throw out some ideas if there are any qualitative researchers amongst you practicing. There are so many things that you can observe, and we just let it drift because we are all Indians and we know it all. There's things like migrant people who come to work in the urban areas, they go back to the village. And what is the effect and the impact, in driving aspirations, in becoming role models. There's ferment out there and lots of emerging things. So the big data will tell you some things. They're spending more, they're spending on urban brands, they're going to urban areas and malls and things. But what's driving that is something that no one really has found out, and I think it's for us as qualitative researchers to find that out. I've had an experience of being in a village, and these young men were really strutting their stuff, walking like, I suppose, Salman Khan in Dabang or something, up and down, like this. And there was a main road outside the village temple. That was the main road, and they just walked up and down, just posing, posing. And they only deigned to talk to us because they thought we were from one of the TV stations taking a film that they could be on it. And so we had a wonderful chance to really talk to them, but they felt that they owned all the new values, belief systems that have been coming into the village. They were and they knew what was good, what was cool. And to see that is so very different. And do you think if you spoke to them or talked to them, or if you saw them individually, you'd even get a feel or a tiny fraction of that kind of feeling of power, having reached, being empowered to move out, and stuff like that. So I'm just underlying and reinforcing what has been said so far, the power of observation and bringing the whole context, your entire experience of an event or what you're watching or seeing or hearing or talking to has to be brought in, especially if you are from India and you know all the other issues that are going on. And so much is happening, as somebody said. And someone needs to nail it down and put words to it and articulate it so that you can do more perhaps sensible marketing, more interesting, more focused or insightful communication, etc. So that's what I would say.